This is the brand new Pentax 17, a new film camera in the digital age, which for us in the film photography community is of course very exciting. In this video I want to take a closer look, show you the things I like, the things I dislike, photographs from the camera, and share my thoughts on the new Pentax 17. A camera review, I suppose. Luna de noche, canto por ti. A couple weeks before the launch of this camera, Pentax approached me on Instagram of all places. They just smoothly slid into my DMs and asked me whether I might have any little bit of interest in this camera. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I'm, well, a bit of a Pentax fanboy. My Pentax K1000 being my favourite film camera. And so I of course went ahead and wrote back that I'm a big fan and that I'm no doubt very curious about what Pentax has made. So big thank you to Pentax for warming my heart with the honour to be in contact with them and receiving this camera from them. Nevertheless, I will of course keep my review honest. The first weeks with this camera I just took it with me on some errands and shot some random stuff I found. However, one day I decided to head up onto Innsbruck's Hausberg, the Crawford, to shoot the rest of the roll in one go. I'll be coming back to this day every now and then so that you can check out the photos that the camera produced. However, now let's have a closer look at the design and the features. My first impression when I unpacked the camera was a positive surprise actually. Mind you, I am not a camera expert. I love photography and cameras are the tool I use to execute that, hence I might know a lot about them, but I'm certainly not a gearhead that knows everything about cameras in great depth. However, the design struck me as very thoughtful and well done, which honestly I wasn't actually expecting. I didn't think they'd go ahead and make something so different to anything I've ever seen. The Pentax 17 is a half-frame semi-automatic film camera. Half-frame means that it takes 35mm film but only shoots half of that frame, hence giving you smaller vertical photos and enabling you to shoot 72 photos per roll of film instead of 36. By semi-automatic, I simply mean that it has a mixture of automatic and manual features. For example, to wind the film to the next frame, you have this lever, unlike a point-and-shoot camera that just does it automatically. Also, for the ISO, the camera does not have a DX code reader, instead you rate the ISO by yourself. By the way, I will be sharing my thoughts and opinions on these decisions in a minute, but first I just wanted to present the camera objectively. Something this camera does automatically is expose the photographs. There is no manual mode on this camera. All you can do is pick a mode that suits you and use the exposure compensation wheel to over or underexpose. Another manual feature of this camera is the zone focusing. It uses a little focusing ring that gives you 6 zones to choose from. If you'd like to check the actual distance though, you can simply look down here and see the numbers. Speaking of the small focusing ring, this here is the lens. A tiny pancake-style lens which helps keep the camera super compact. It's a 25mm f3.5 lens which equates to a full frame equivalent of 37mm. By the way, if you look closely, right above the lens you'll find the light meter, so make sure you don't cover that with your finger when shooting.
Can I tell you what's on my mind?
3 more remarkable points on this camera that I'd like to mention are the following. It has an on-off switch, which is interesting, makes sense I guess to save battery life, which by the way stems from a CR2 battery that hides inside the grip of the camera. It has a flash, which is simply worth mentioning. And finally, let's have a look at the viewfinder. It's a rangefinder style viewfinder just in the middle, not on the side, so it does not look through the lens and uses frame lines to show you your framing. At the bottom of the viewfinder is a little extra magnifier which shows you the icon of your selected focusing zone. So that was a brief summary of the main features and decisions Pentax made for this camera. Let me share my thoughts with you, which of course are very subjective and might not apply to you, but it's just my perspective. Let's begin with what I like. I love that they went for some manual features such as the lever and the film rewinder. Those tactile features of a film camera are in part what makes the process fun for me, so of course I'm happy to see that they chose to include them in this design. Also, I'm a huge fan of the exposure compensation wheel. As someone who shoots a lot with the Olympus XA3, which is also a semi-automatic camera that exposes automatically, I've had many experiences with the Olympus misreading situations that can be tricky, such as snowy landscapes, and consequently underexposing the shot. There are ways to work around that on the Olympus, but none are as easy and simple as a good old exposure compensation wheel. Of course, you could just use the ISO wheel to rate your film differently, but I personally really appreciate that there's a wheel dedicated to this purpose. Another thing I absolutely love is this tiny lens. One of the main reasons why I love the Olympus XA3 is its size. It's so small, so it really works as my carry with me all the time type of camera. I find that a tiny lens size makes carrying a camera so much easier, so this pancake design is much appreciated. A minor thing I also like, mostly because I miss it on the Pentax K1000, is this card holder where I can slide in my film to remember what film I have inside the camera.
Ja, heute ist die Sonne mal wieder schön draußen, deswegen ist kurz Licht heute.
Next, let's talk about the viewfinder, which brings me to the first thing that I have mixed feelings about before we get to things that I'm critical of. The viewfinder is super clear and bright, top quality. It has two different frame lines, one for wide shots of subjects in far distance, and the other is adjusted for the field of view when shooting something closer to the camera. I really like the thoughtful detail they added to the design that enables me to see my focus zone while looking through the viewfinder. Something I however don't like is that it has a blue tint, which I know is nitpicky, but I really dislike that blue tint, especially when I see a scene that I want to shoot and I'm already envisioning the final photo in warm Kodak tones, and then I look through the viewfinder and it's cold. Anyway, let's get to some of the negatives. One thing I was immediately slightly disappointed by was the materials they used for the camera. The top and the bottom are actually made of magnesium alloy, however the middle is plastic. The issue I had here is that the camera just doesn't feel at all rigid. They used magnesium alloy but still made it super lightweight, which I guess has its perks, but personally I would much prefer a heavier camera that feels a little stronger and bulkier. Coming from a Pentax K1000, the contrast in this department is painfully stark. The camera seems so well designed and even quite premium, but then when you hold the Pentax 17, it suddenly doesn't feel at all premium. However, I suppose their argument is that this is supposed to be a lightweight, carry everywhere all the time type of camera like the Olympus XA3. However, then I don't understand why they made the camera so big. As you can see, it is significantly bigger than my Olympus XA3, even though the Olympus XA3 shoots double the frame size. Of course, a bigger camera is advantageous for better grip. However, to me personally, it seems a bit like they couldn't choose between good grip, bulk and heavy versus small size and light material. They just mixed the two, which works, but I think it makes the camera a little mediocre in this regard. But apart from that, there aren't any striking negatives that I came across while shooting. The final and arguably most important aspect of this camera we still need to check more closely is, of course, the photos. Then, before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank the continued sponsor of the channel, Squarespace. Squarespace is an easy-to-use all-in-one website platform. I've been using Squarespace for my website for close to 5 years now, and I'm still so happy with it, mainly because it's so easy for someone like me who is certainly not a web developer. I use my Squarespace website as a portfolio where I showcase projects of mine. However, you can build pretty much anything on Squarespace, be it a simple blog or an online shop or a site for bookings if you're a freelancer. They will have what you need. I built my page by starting off with a template, which Squarespace offers a whole lot of, and then customizing the layout and design to my liking. This process has been so well optimized by them thanks to their drag and drop editor called Fluid Engine. I seriously love that they've created this tool that makes the process of being creative while making a website not feel slow or tedious, even though I'm a technical noob when it comes to web design. I really recommend that you try it out for yourself. You can head to squarespace.com for a 14-day free trial, by the way, and then when you're ready to launch your website, you can go to squarespace.com/TeoCrawford to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for continuously supporting my channel and my work here. I really appreciate it.
Old man on the corner, selling pencils from a cup. Big man giving out orders, turns to us, says listen up.
The day I picked for the shoot was sunny, but with some clouds floating around here and there, which occasionally made the lighting a little weird, but overall I was feeling pretty good. I thought I was getting some good shots here and there of the beautiful scenery up here. And now, looking at the results, I think these are pretty alright. Seeing as the camera is a half-frame camera, it naturally nudges me to shoot vertically, which I must say was quite a challenge for me. I used to shoot vertically a lot a while back, but nowadays I'm very much in love with simply shooting horizontally, and it's come to the point that I really don't enjoy vertical that much, and I was finding that to be a bit of a challenge when shooting with the Pentax 17. However, we should consider that the subject matter and environment I decided to shoot on this day probably is to blame in some part. Shooting in nature, I generally find myself strongly focusing on horizontal photographs, whereas when shooting downtown in a city, vertical compositions can become easier to find, at least for me personally. So as you can see, I did end up rotating the camera at times to shoot horizontally anyway, simply because in my eyes it suited the composition much better.
Take a drive out to the country, look around to breathe the air. Oh yeah, if I get tired, you get pumped.
So now let's have a chat about the photos. I think they look great. The film I used, by the way, was Kodak's Portra 400. I chose that film because I thought shooting half the frame sort of equals double the grain size. I personally love the grain of films like Kodak Gold on 35mm, but I think on half frame that might be a bit too much for my taste. Whereas Portra usually is a little too fine for my taste, and thus I speculated that maybe on half frame it will look great. And I think that was not a bad idea. The detail and grain looks great. This also shows the quality of the lens, which I must say is a big plus of this camera. As far as I can tell, Pentax put a lot of thought and care into the lens, which looks great in my opinion. I think this is quite important, especially when shooting half frame, so that the camera is still capable of producing sharp photos. So looking at these, I'd say Pentax has done a great job in this regard. As someone who is used to shooting 35mm all the time, I definitely see the difference when I look at it on the monitor. However, Pentax has stated that the main intention of this camera is to view it on the phone on social media, which I think is a fair intention because, I mean, let's be honest, 95% of the analog photography I see is on Instagram. And on my phone, these photos seriously look great. They've definitely reached their goal there. Now, before I come to my final conclusion, let's talk about one more thing that caused a bit of a stir in the film photography community: the price. The Pentax 17 is listed for $500 US, which many have stated is too high for what the camera is. And I get that. There seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between the price and the target audience for the product. It's a half-frame camera for enthusiasts and beginners who want to shoot film and share their photography on mobile devices. For this audience, $500 US appears a bit pricey. However, I thought a little more about this and realized that we might have a bit of a skewed view on film camera prices. We've become so used to buying retro gear for pennies. This makes sense on the second-hand market because many sellers simply don't know what the item they're selling is worth. They often don't even know whether it's functional. And so if you take simple supply and demand into consideration, the prices make sense, because there just aren't that many people buying film cameras, but 30 years ago film cameras were the norm and hence there is an abundance of cameras. Combine that with a lack of knowledge on the seller's side and it's less of a surprise that I have been able to buy this Zenit E, for example, for 10 euros. The only cameras that cost upward of 150 euros are the ones that are in actual high demand because people know of that camera and aim to buy that specific model. So of course, a brand new camera that has not been in existence for 30 or more years is going to be more expensive. Also, I did some research to find out what film cameras actually cost back then when they were released, and then adjusted that price for inflation. Sadly, I was not able to compare the Pentax 17 to any camera I wanted to because finding out what the release price was is actually quite difficult, but here are 3 examples I could find that can just give us some perspective. The Minolta X700 was released in 1981 and sold in the US for $400, which adjusted for inflation would now be around $1,380. By the way, I'll leave the sources for my data in the description. The Canon AE1 was considered a budget camera and cost $165 in 1981, which today equates to about $570. And finally, my beloved Pentax K1000, without a lens, only the body, cost $210 in 1988, which today is equivalent of $560. So I think you see the point I'm making. I completely understand that $500 is a lot of money for a camera of this caliber. However, we need to keep in mind that our perception of camera prices is heavily skewed, and when you put that into perspective, the price is kind of understandable. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. I must say, I'm positively surprised by the camera. It's better designed and overall more sophisticated than I was expecting. I'm not really a fan of the materials and the build quality, but they're not bad, just not particularly good either. Some don't like the zone focusing system. I personally like it actually. I'm used to it from my Olympus XA3. Another good aspect of this camera is the lens, which I find produces great results. So while this camera is marketed as a bit more of a casual camera that gives you double the amount of shots for half the resolution and incentivizes you to just shoot instead of overthinking it, I'm happy to see that they still put great effort into a good quality lens. The question though is, who is this camera for? To be honest, before receiving the camera, I thought I might be the perfect guy for this camera. Actually, about a year ago, I was on the lookout for a half-frame camera because I thought it'd be great to have a more casual camera that allows me to take 72 shots with less pressure. Also, my everyday camera has been the Olympus XA3, which is fantastic, but I have some issues with the way it exposes my photos. And so, I thought a half-frame camera that shoots automatically but features an exposure compensation wheel so that I could overexpose certain scenes could be the solution for me. However, sadly, I've been proven wrong. But not because the camera is bad or anything, I just can't find a liking for half-frame. You must know, I'm a huge fan of the 35mm format. That's one of the reasons why you've never seen me shoot medium format, because 35mm is just so perfect for me. And so to convince me of half-frame is obviously not easy, but it might have been possible with some changes. Personally, I just dislike to shoot vertical by default, so that makes the camera less of a joy to use, or maybe they could design a half-frame camera that does shoot horizontal frames. Anyway, this could have been compensated if the camera was super small thanks to the half-frame of the size, but it turned out to be even bigger than my full-frame Olympus XA3. So actually, it's a great camera, but it just doesn't suit me. I think if they would have made exactly the same camera but in full frame, I would have been a big fan and it would probably replace my Olympus XA3. But due to the factors mentioned, I'm sadly not fully convinced by it. However, I know myself and that my opinion tends to change a lot over time, so who knows, I might find a liking for it in a year. But nevertheless, I think Pentax has done a great job and I want to express my gratitude to them for investing into film photography in this way and blessing us with this new camera. I still think this is amazing and maybe one day I would like to see a full-frame camera. But in any case, thank you, Pentax. I hope I could add a valuable perspective on this camera for you in this video. Feel free or encouraged to continue the conversation in the comment section. Before saying goodbye, I would like to thank the lovely people supporting me in my work on Patreon. Thank you so much to each one of you. If you're interested in Lightroom presets, tutorials or postcards, you can check out my page via the link in the description. Also, I have a print shop in case that is of interest to you, also in the description. With that said, I hope to see you again soon. Until then, goodbye.